Okay, I have the pleasure of introducing next Femke Speelberg, who's an assistant curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum in charge of our ornament and architecture collection. She studied art history and visual culture at the Radboud University in Nijmegen and completed her studies with a thesis on the origins of 16th century strapwork ornament at Fontainebleau. She organized the exhibition Living in Style, 5 Centuries of Interior Design from the collection of drawings and prints at the Met in 2013, and is currently working on an exhibition about our outstanding collection of Renaissance textile pattern books that will open on October 20th. She's currently working on a book about early modern ornament prints and the establishment of the genre in early modern print culture. The title of her talk today is A New Ornament Emerges, Flemish Grotesques and International Artistic Exchange in the Circle of Peter Coecke van Aalst. Femke.
Okay. I want to say thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak here. I'm so very happy to be at Parsons today because as a sort of propagator for historic ornament, I'm always very happy to introduce it to new generations of designers in the hope that some cross-pollination will occur. And in fact, cross-pollination is what I'll be talking about today. So with the risk of frightfully upsetting my colleagues, I would like to begin this lecture of the final weekend of this wonderful exhibition by giving it a new title. So Grand designed Peter Coecke van Aalst and Renaissance Tapestry, at least for the upcoming 25 minutes or so, becomes, oops, there we go. Truth and Details, Tapestry and Ornament in Coecke's Gothic Baroque. I'm fully aware that had the exhibition been given this title, the show would have probably only had one visitor, me. But I hope that my reasons for introducing the title here will become clear over the course of this paper. For those of you who attended yesterday, Koen Brozens discussed several methodologies of tapestry research. I would here like to introduce another one, which, while it does not shine new light on Peter Coecke van Aalst directly, attempts to provide some helpful touchstones to stimulate further thought and research on the dating, style, and production of the tapestries and other monumental tapestries during the 16th century. There's a lot to say about ornament in the works of Peter Coecke van Aalst, and in general in the southern Netherlands during his lifetime, in which Antwerp and Brussels formed the centers of intense cultural cross-pollination and what appears to be a very close-knit network of collaboration and exchange. What I'd like to do today is focus on these aspects through a case study, for which I've chosen the borders of several editions of Peter Coecke's series of the 7 Deadly Sins. This set of tapestries is without a doubt one of my favorites in the show, because they show not only the full extent of Coecke's ingenuity, but they also represent a cross-section of Antwerp's cultural and artistic climate during the first half of the 16th century. While borders, understandably, are in general not the focus of studies in tapestry, they are very much of interest when we place them within the wider interdisciplinary development of the decorated frame during the 15th and early 16th century. We generally tend to understand frames from a functional perspective, as a separation between our world and the world portrayed in the artwork it frames. Frames from a window into the world, an aspect which is shown very literally in this miniature from the Book of Hours of Mary of Burgundy here on the left. At the same time, however, this miniature also is very indicative of the identity change the frame underwent, or rather how it was promoted to a higher level of importance during the Renaissance. Due to the central placement of the concept of disegno, here to be understood as the ingenuity of design, and the growing awareness of the interior as a united decorative scheme, or Gesamtkunstwerk, if you will, frames became the focus of artistic invention in their own right, adding an additional dimension to the work of art it contained, which offered lots of room for ingenuity and design. To the right is a beautiful southern Netherlands example of the latter development by the Bruges artist Lancelot Blondel. Artists began to play with the levels of reality, merging the worlds of the frame and the framed by introducing overlapping elements and significant iconographic connections between the one and the other. In certain cases, such as the miniature of Mary of Burgundy, And even more clearly, for example, in Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, this development caused the lines between the one and the other to blur completely. While in narrative tapestry, this intense level of interweaving between border and central scene was never exactly reached, we can clearly see that in the period between circa 1500 and 1550, more and more attention is paid to the design and execution of the borders, which, in certain cases, were feats of rather sophisticated artistry. Relatively little is known about the design and production of these borders, and when the weaver's marks are not visibly woven into the structure or have been lost, in most cases, very little that seems of use can be gleaned from them, unless you know how to read a different kind of language. Peter Coecke's tapestry series of the 7 Deadly Sins makes for a very useful object of study in this respect. Commissioned or initiated around 1532, right before Coecke's journey to Constantinople and likely journey through Italy, multiple sets of the series were made in the relatively short period of about 15 years. Individual tapestries survive from 5 out of the 6 or 7 documented sets, and for at least the 4 earliest sets, information is known about their principal or subsequent owners. Focusing on the first 4 sets, we discovered that they each have their own distinct border design. The first set, which was woven under the direction of Paulus van Opperman in about 1534 for the British King Henry VIII, shows continuous opulent garlands with vegetable motifs and floral motifs, which are hard to see in this photo, unfortunately, but it's at the Morgan Library if anyone cares to go and see it. The second set, woven under the direction of Willem de Pannemaker before 1544, belonged to Mary of Hungary. Its borders also show flowers and greens, but are here arranged in bunches and combined with birds and putti. The third set, which is dated in the mid of the 1540s, was done by an unidentified weaver who had been associated with Willem de Pannemaker in the production of the second set we just saw. The tapestries were made for Lamoral, the Count of Egmont, but were later owned by King Philip of Spain. The borders of this set repeat the motif of bunches of greens and flowers, but are here combined with Flemish grotesque figures and large architectural terminal figures on both sides. The fourth set, finally, done for an unidentified patron, but was later possibly owned by Charles III, Duke of Lorraine, was again executed under the direction of Willem de Pannemaker. The set is generally dated to about 1548, 1549, closely following the third edition, and its borders are decorated completely with the Flemish grotesque motifs. For those of you who might not be as familiar with this type of ornament as I am, I will give a brief introduction. As is suggested by their name, Flemish grotesques are related to the better-known grotesque decorations which gained new popularity in Italy after the rediscovery of antique wall decorations, such as the ones in the Domus Aurea and other remains of Roman dwellings. They were reinvigorated in the antique manner by Raphael and the artists from his workshop in the early 16th century. The decorations are characterized by their candelabra-shaped arrangements of fantastical architecture and constructions, and inhabited by all sorts of figures and creatures. Despised by Vitruvius for their surreal, illogical nature, the grotesques played an extremely important role in stimulating artists to fantasize. While in Italy, grotesque decorations soon followed a standardized formula, north of the Alps, the ties with classical antiquity were not as strong, and there was more room for license in their design. The Flemish grotesques are a product of this development. They are not simply, as the name might falsely suggest, grotesques that remain in Flanders, but are characterized by a very distinct vocabulary of shapes and creatures of a fantastical and nightmarish nature, often imprisoned or encapsulated by strapwork contraptions. They most often appear in frieze form, in which the parade motif with triumphal cards is popular, but all over candelabra arrangements were also created. Their specific vocabulary and relative sudden arrival in Flanders, and particularly Antwerp in the early 1540s, strongly suggest that their creation could be attributed to one specific artist. Historically, however, this was not always assumed to be the case. The first publications on the topic came out in a time that also gave birth to the theoretical writings of Alois Riegel and Gottfried Semper. Many developments were described to the so-called Zeitgeist or Zeitstil, which left no room for contributions of the individual, but assigned characteristics to a specific period and region of art production. This aspect was held important for the Flemish grotesques because they were seen as the product of a clash of site styles in which the regions north and south of the Alps were diagonally opposed. The north was characterized by infinite, dynamic, irrational ornament, whereas in Italy, ornament was only introduced in the margins, its space and order strongly controlled by decorum. In addition, various qualities were assigned to the individual style periods based on the polar system of Heinrich Wölfflin. The styles were divided into painterly and the sculptural, which respectively represented an optic and a tactile approach to art and decoration. They also represent psychological impulses, feeling versus reason. In this system, the Renaissance was considered sculptural, tactile, and based on reason. The Baroque instead was painterly in essence, therefore optic and based on feeling. The Gothic period, however, was more difficult to define because it moved from one to the other over the course of its history. It began as optical, but had become tactile by the end of the 15th century, and then started to move back towards the optical during the 15th century. What happened during the 1540s in the southern Netherlands is that the northern and southern cultures meshed, and the area became a meeting point for all three currents in Wölfflin's system in a period that was coined the Gothic Baroque. When we visualize the model that was sketched in the early literature, the Flemish grotesque sprang from the following visual model. Mix one part of the licentious inventions of Hieronymus Bosch with the Italian grotesques reintroduced by Raphael in his school, which were brought to the north by Italian artists settling abroad, traveling artists who visited Italy, and traveling art, such as prints and the cartoons for Raphael's Tapestry series of the Apostles. Add to this the strapwork designs developed by Rosso Fiorentino in the school of Fontainebleau, and finally introduced the strangely plumed composite figures from the New World, which were first brought to Brussels in 1520, and made Albrecht Dürer's heart rejoice in the artistic ingenuity of the men of distant lands. While this model addresses exchange and influence, and therefore to a degree illustrates the intense cross-pollination that shaped the Southern Netherlands art in the 1540s, it does not tell us the full story of the actual invention of Flemish grotesques. As we know, the history of art is not a story of predestination or a mathematical equation. Its vicissitudes more closely resemble the chaotic utterances of the butterfly effect. Just like in evolution theory, from the same beginnings, the same basic elements, many different forms of art can emerge depending on the cook that's in the kitchen. So who was the cook in the kitchen for the Flemish grotesques? And was he also directly involved in the production of the borders of the third and fourth editions of Peter Coecke's Flemish 7 Deadly Sins series? Through a group of prints and drawings depicting this type of ornament, the Flemish grotesques are now most often associated with Cornelis Bos and Cornelis Floris de Vriend. While the earliest dated ornament prints of this type were made by Cornelis Bos, in Bos's principal biography, its author came to the conclusion that the actual invention of this type of ornament should be attributed to his namesake Cornelis Floris, and as such, this type of ornament is also known as Floris grotesques. This attribution was principally based on the initials Cornelis Floris executed in the so-called Licheren, which were the record books of the Antwerp Guild of St. Luke. The entries for the years between 1541 and 1560 are executed in the manner of the Flemish grotesques. Carl van der Velde has argued convincingly, however, that based on the use of ink and the execution of the initials, it appears they were made over several campaigns rather than yearly, and he believed that the first campaign did not take place before sometime between 1544 and 1546. Several other drawings in various European collections with the same type of ornament, which are in most cases are dated but curiously not signed, exist. The dates of the drawings, which are all either attributed to Floris himself or his circle, range from 1540 to 1543. Whether these dates were added immediately is questionable, however. While it appears to be a 16th century hand, they give the impression of being written in haste, possibly at a slightly later time, with the intention of illustrating chronology and perhaps even primacy, a fact that is now very difficult to prove true or false. Unfortunately, similar to the designs known through prints, so far none of the drawings can be linked to works of art in other disciplines, making it difficult to understand what their purpose was. I should mention that there's one exception to this fact in which a motif from one of Floris's drawings at the Fondation Custodia, we see it here in the design marked 1543 on the top, is repeated in a print published by Cornelis Boss. And this is a relationship that needs further investigation, but does not help to solve our current problem. Around the same time, moreover, we see that motifs from the Flemish grotesques start to appear elsewhere in various disciplines. The sculptor Colijn de Nole, for example, used several of the characteristic motifs in the Schepenzaal in Kampen, which he begun in 1543. In the same year, a book of Moresque designs was published by Cornelis Boss with a title page that, or rather crudely cut, shows the typical grotesques and its inhabitants in a rather developed form. Fragments of Maiolica, an art form that was practiced in Antwerp at least since the arrival of the Italian potter Guido da Savino or Guido Andries, who ran his business Den Zalm in the Kammerstraat in Antwerp from before 1508, also showed a typical ornament vocabulary. While the attribution to Floris is understandable based on the known attributed drawings, we should take note that several people, including Cornelis, were working with this new type of ornament from early on. It is possible, nevertheless, that it spread from a particular workshop or a specific family. The Floris family is interested in this respect since there were 4 artist brothers who together united some of the most important art forms of their day. Frans, the painter, Cornelis, the sculptor and architect, Jacques, the glass painter, and Jan, the successful Maiolica potter, who entered the service of Philip of Spain but died young. Interesting in this respect is Karel van Mander's remark, included in the life of Cornelis Floris in the Schilderboek, regarding Jan. While now largely forgotten, van Mander recognized in him a very talented draftsman and painter who created all sorts of subtleties, little scenes and little figures, on that earthenware or porcelain of which Frans has a number in his home that are worth seeing. The fully preserved tile tableau depicting the conversion of Saul in the Flanders House Museum in Bruges seems to confirm that Jan did work in this vocabulary. The tableau is dated 1547, and its design and execution are attributed to Frans and Jan Floris respectively. Frans is held responsible for the design of the narrative scene, which in turn is strongly inspired, if not based on Peter Coecke's design for the same subject, made for the Tapestry series of the life of Saul. And here seen in a drawing from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The decorative borders, which make the tile tableau into a striking comparison with the contemporary tapestries, were almost certainly not designed by Frans Floris, however, but should most likely be given to his brother Jan, who might be responsible for introducing knowledge of the Flemish grotesques in Spain as well. They appear in a group of Spanish drawings attributed by Nicole Decos to a painter named Andrés de Melgar, who collected on the sheets of a sketchbook numerous motifs of grotesque ornaments, which he seems to have copied from other sources. What is striking is that the draftsman collected both Italian grotesque motifs and Flemish, and was keenly aware of the difference. He made notes on the sheets attributing the Italian designs to Giulio, possibly Giulio Romano, and annotated the Flemish grotesque designs with the word flamenco, but not, as I'd like to point out, Floris. Similarly, no mention is made of Cornelis or another Floris, for that matter, in the book published to commemorate the decorations for this festival entry of Philip of Spain. Published by Peter Coecke van Aalst in 1550, half of the designs for the triumphal arches in ephemeral architecture are crowned with stratwork and Flemish grotesques, and the decorations demarcate the absolute height of the popularity of the ornament. While several of his designs would only later appear in print, by the early 1550s it appeared that Cornelis Floris himself was already moving on, leaving behind the whimsical Flemish ornaments for a more classical vocabulary that would give him great success on an international scale. It has been suggested that Peter Coecke himself possibly had something to do with the designs of this ephemeral architecture for the festival entry, but his name is not recorded in this capacity, and its use of this type of ornament is sparingly at best. To return then to the tapestries of the 7 deadly sins. Having traced the history of this characteristic ornament that decorates the borders of the 3rd and 4th editions of the tapestries, is there anything new that we can say about them? Is it likely, for example, that Peter Coecke van Aalst was responsible for the design of the borders for the editions of this tapestry? For several reasons, I would like to answer that question here with a careful no. First of all, in comparison, many discrepancies are noticeable in the quality of the border designs, by which I do not mean the execution of the various editions. This aspect is beautifully illustrated by the 7 Deadly Sins series because they were done under the direction of several different weavers over a relatively short period of time, and all still during the life of Peter Coecke van Aalst. Even though from one to the next edition, several of the same decorative elements were adopted, they betrayed different aesthetic sensibilities, or even capabilities, if you will. Even in the 2 specific cases of the borders with the Flemish grotesques, the difference is very distinct. When looking at the borders of the 3rd edition by the so far unidentified weaver and comparing them to the extant drawings and prints portraying this type of ornament, we notice that aside from the general execution of the figures, which could be due to the hand of the weaver, the overall composition and placement of motifs is far less balanced. The designer or designers of the borders appear to have understood very well the appeal and popularity of the ornament, and therefore decided to fill them to the brim with as many of the whimsical motifs as they possibly could, without necessarily being very well versed in their execution. In contrast, the borders done for the 4th edition under the direction of Willem de Pannemaker are, while still somewhat full, far more balanced than their predecessor. From the use of motifs, it is clear that the designer took his cue more directly from some of the first prints with this type of ornament that had just been published by Cornelis Bos, or was inspired in its design by the previously referenced tile tableau of the Conversion of Saul of 1547. I would here like to stress that there is no direct reason to think that this person should be identified with any of the Flores brothers or Cornelis Bos. As I have argued elsewhere, ornament in this period seems to have been considered as communal property, a fountain of motifs which are not necessarily attributed or restricted to the use of one artist or inventor. If at all, a perimeter can be seen in their distinctly Flemish connotation, which was recognized contemporaneously, as we have seen, by the Spaniard Andrés de Melgar. This then leads me to a 3rd and final suggestion, which is that from a first comparison of the tapestries and their borders related to Peter Coecke van Aalst, I come to the conclusion that the authorship of the borders, in many cases, is connected to the workshop of the weaver. While cartoons for the narrative scenes of a tapestry may have been used by several workshops, the border designs and their idiosyncrasies seem privy to a specific workshop. If accepted, this may mean that where weavers' marks are not or no longer present, the content of borders may thus help us to further reconstruct the output of a specific known and unknown workshop. While this arguably needs further research and is complicated in cases where a consortium of weavers is concerned, it may be possible, for example, to connect the 3rd edition of the 7 Sins tapestries to the same unidentified Brussels-based weavers' workshop as 2 other purely ornamental florist-style tapestries in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, of which I show you one here. For my own preliminary research, it appears that Willem de Pannemaker in particular employed one or several rather sophisticated designers for the borders of the tapestries he executed. In style, they were very attuned to contemporary tastes and developments, as is illustrated in particularly by the 2nd and 4th editions of the 7 Sins tapestries, both done under his direction in a relatively short period of time, with completely different border designs. It is further illustrated, moreover, by the adaptation in the Pannemaker's workshop of a specific type of Moresque design, which was used, amongst others, for the series of Vertumnus and Pomona, the Poesia, and the Conquest of Tunis. They were almost certainly inspired by a very rare print series published by the famous Antwerp publisher Hieronymus Coecke in 2 editions, of which one is dated 1550, but which may have been preceded by another, undated earlier edition. If this contention is true, then this small scrap of tapestry border here on above, given to the museum in 2002, almost certainly comes from the workshop of Willem de Pannemaker as well. To conclude, I would like to clearly state that further research through close looking and comparative material analysis is necessary to further corroborate the ideas I've expressed here regarding the tapestry borders related to Coecke's 7 Deadly Sins. I would like to underline that I do not claim that Peter Cuco van Aalst had nothing to do with the designs and the decision-making process concerning the borders of his tapestries. A certain level of deliberation should, especially with regards to the first editions of each series, be taken into account. The witty interplay between the narrative scene and border, which we see in the life of St. Paul, where books are tumbling into the realm of the border, seems a clear suggestion of this interaction. But, as the analysis of the ornamental details has shown, like most other branches of art and industry in the southern Netherlands at the time, the design process of the tapestry borders appears to have become an important part of the entrepreneurial professionalization of the weavers' workshops, and could be usefully employed by weavers' workshops to put their mark in yet another way on some of the most important art commissions executed in Europe during the 16th century. Thank you.